Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Welcome to Planet America. Hello, I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Lichigolo.
This week, Democrats notch up more midterm victories and some distinct echoes of 2000 in the state of Florida.
It's like a political circus that we've seen before that shouldn't be going on.
And I'll be looking at the secret to the Democrats' success. The kids and Latinos finally showed up.
And in the history department, with one eye on 2020, I'll look at how tough it is to beat a sitting president from inside their own party.
Well, my belief is to the contrary.
But first, let's get newsy.
The week began with around a dozen House races still up in the air and a recount in the Florida Senate, gubernatorial and Agriculture Commissioners races. Meanwhile, counting continued in the Arizona Senate contest between Democrat Kyrsten Sinema and Republican Martha McSally. As Sinema pulled ahead, President Trump sent this tweet alleging electoral fraud.
Just out in Arizona, signatures don't match electoral corruption. Call for a new election. We must protect our democracy.
But instead of calling for a new election, Martha McSally put out this video.
I just called Kyrsten Sinema and congratulated her on becoming Arizona's first female senator after a hard-fought battle.
The final result, less than 30,000 votes in it. The Democrat winning with 49.7% of the vote to the Republicans' 48%. A pickup for the Democrats following the retirement of Jeff Flake. So the president's focus then shifted to Florida.
Trying to steal two big elections in Florida. We are watching closely.
Well, under Florida law, any election with a margin of under half a percentage point triggers an automatic machine recount of ballots. Under 1/4 of a percentage point, and it is a hand recount. In an echo of the infamous 2000 presidential recount in Florida, the lawsuits have been flying this week. Ballots have been turning up mysteriously, but so far it doesn't look like the result will change. That means, as of now, Republicans hold 52 Senate seats with 4 pickups and 2 losses, a net gain of 2. Democrats therefore have 47 Senate seats, a net loss of 2. The final Senate seat to be decided is in the state of Mississippi, where a special election at the end of the month is likely to go to the Republicans. And there are still a few House elections to be finalised. But based on current projections, the Democrats have picked up a total of 38 seats, giving them 233 seats in the next Congress, to the Republicans 202, which, if I'm not very much mistaken, Chaz, adds up to a majority of 15.
Bravo! Well done. Look, the numbers are continuing to dribble in, but at this point, the turnout of these midterms is up to 49.2%, the highest midterms turnout since 1966, when the minimum voting age was 21. The projected popular vote margin is now up to 7.5%, which is larger than the margins in 1994 or in 2010. Now, not every race has been decided yet, but the people elected so far, John, I would have to say could be the best of the best.
Really? How so?
Oh yes. Indicted Congressman Chris Collins is likely to return, and he'll be joined by indicted Congressman Duncan Hunter and indicted Attorney General Ken Paxton, and the lucky to escape corruption charges on a loophole Bob Menendez, and the self-confessed assaulter Greg Gianforte, and the guy who made up his resume, Steve Watkins, and of course everyone's favourite dead pimp Dennis Hoff. All worthy winners. Who says criminals can't get jobs? But there were some firsts apart from the dead pimp. Alex Ocasio-Cortez, at 29, is the youngest congressperson ever. We've got the first 2 Muslim women in Congress, the first 2 Native American women in Congress, the first openly gay man to be governor, the first openly bisexual senator. We might have the first Korean American in Congress, but unfortunately she's projected to lose, which is a shame because she's Republican and they could do with a diversity. The House Democrats went from 41% white men to 38% white men after this election, whereas the House Republicans went from 86% white men to 90% white men. There are also 9 new scientists elected to Congress, often on climate change platforms. Bottom line, there's lots of new people. In fact, apart from 1992, there are the most new people in Congress right now since 1950. So those are the Congress people.
Okay, But if we look at Republican House results in just a Republican president's first midterm, it shows 2018 in a really interesting light. Take a look. The result this year is the second worst ever, behind only Jerry Ford's Republicans in 1974, 3 months after Nixon resigned. So, Trump's Republicans have lost 21 House seats more than that average, and that is in an economy that is continuing to expand. In 1954, Eisenhower faced an election year recession. So did Nixon in 1970, Ford in 74 as well, and Reagan had a recession in 82. So maybe on that, it's a blue wave after all.
Okay, one more thought. What does this augur for 2020? Well, if America votes in 2020, like they did this year, that would be the electoral map, a comfortable Democratic victory. But taking it further, even if the Democrats lost 6 points right across the country, then the electoral map would look like that. The Democrats would still narrowly win the election. So that'd be good news for the Democrats, yes?
Guess so.
Not really. The vertical axis here is showing presidential vote margins, and the horizontal axis is showing the seat gains in the previous midterms. And if that's just looking like a bunch of random dots with no pattern, that's because it is. There is no pattern between the midterms and presidential election results whatsoever. So this election stands on its own. But do we at least know who the voters were? Well, step this way.
Big, beautiful world.
Now, before we break this down, I should point out that Democrats did do pretty well across the board. If you compare the 2018 Democratic result to Hillary's share of the vote, you can see they did slightly better than her, that is the blue areas, almost everywhere. Lots of blue on that map. In fact, according to the exit polls, Democrats even took 10% off the Republicans' margin amongst white Southerners. On the other hand, while they did do quite well, there were no wild upsets anywhere either. They didn't, for instance, flip a single Republican seat where Trump won more than 55% of the vote. But some demographics did do better than others. First of all, the Democratic strategy to turn out new voters does seem to have paid off. Out of the 16% that were first-time voters, 62% of them voted Democrat. And some of the key voters that they tried to turn out were Latinos. Well, according to ABC's exit polls, they did a great job of that. 12% of voters were Hispanic, which is a lot more than in previous midterms. And according to CNN's exit polls, those Latinos voted 69% Democrat. In particular, they voted 69% Democrat in Arizona, 67% in Nevada, and 64% in Texas, where they made up 23%, 19%, and 30% of the electorate respectively. So by my count, that is 2 tight Senate wins and almost a third for the Democrats, thanks to the Latino vote. But what about the infamous youth vote? Did the youth finally turn up? Yes, 31% of 18 to 29s turned out to vote according to the exit polls, which sounds a bit lame, but if those numbers hold up, that is a historically big turnout, as was the vote itself. 67% Democrat, that is a very big gap opening up there. And like the Latino vote, there were direct consequences. Under 29s made up 15% of the Montana electorate and voted 67% for John Tester, getting him over the line. And in the nail-biter Wisconsin governor's race, the kids voted 60% for Democrats and made up 14% of the vote, so that probably made the difference to Scott Walker losing as well. And by the way, the millennials are getting older, and now there is a 19-point gap opening up in the 30 to 44s as well. Republicans would not like the look of that. On to the women's vote. And they also delivered for Democrats. Women voted more Democrat than at any time for decades, creating a 23-point gender gap, even though the men really didn't vote all that Republican either. This change flowed through to white women who tied the vote 49-all between Democrats and Republicans. Might not sound like a big deal, I know, but in 2016, they voted 55 to 43 for Republicans. similarly in 2014. So that there is pretty bad news for Republicans, although interestingly, it was not a uniform move. In the South, 60% of white women still support Republicans and Ted Cruz, and 75% of white women supported Brian Kemp in Georgia. So white women saved Republicans twice there, although not so much the white college-educated women. The white college-educated women have been pretty Democrat for a while now, but now they're pushing up to about 65% Democrat, at least according to this likely voter study. Meanwhile, white non-college educated men continue to be one of the Republicans' most reliable groups at less than 40% Democrat. Education, when I say those two lines versus those two lines, is becoming a bigger and bigger partisan identifier. And when you add to the fact that the record 37% of the vote this year was from these two college graduates, you get this. Democrats won 81% of the districts with the highest share of college graduates, and Republicans won about 60% of the districts with the lowest shares of college graduates. And where do those college graduates live? In the suburbs, which is why the Dems went from holding 35 sparse suburban seats to 50, and they went from holding 56 dense suburban seats to 68. That is 27 seats picked up just there. Whereas for urban suburban seats, they only picked up 5. Mind you, that's because they hold them all already. Republicans only had 1 of them. The same with pure urban seats. They hold literally all of them now. Republicans have none. But note, the Republicans hold all the rural suburban seats, or at least most of them, and most of the pure rural seats as well. The Democrats basically picked up none of them. All the action was up here in the suburbs, 75% of their seats picked up, which is not to say that Democrats didn't win votes in rural areas. It was the lowest Republican margin there for quite some time, but the Democrats didn't win seats in the rural areas. And here is the interesting bit. There was one other group that they did not win. They didn't win the old mining and industrial towns where the party used to dominate. They only did okay in the Midwest because of their big margins in the suburbs and better performances in rural areas. In other words, they haven't actually won back the voters that they lost in 2016. And that could make 2020 very interesting.
Big, beautiful world.
Okay, let's get some more for you now on the recount in Florida. An expert opinion on the claims of voter fraud and voter suppression in the state and neighbouring Georgia as well.
We should say though, John, that while a bunch of laws may well have been broken in Florida in the last couple of weeks, a judge found no evidence of counting fraud, and neither did Florida's Department of Law Enforcement or Rick Scott's own Department of State.
Hasn't stopped the accusations, though.
Hasn't.
Well, Donald Jones is Professor of Law at the University of Miami. He is an expert on civil and voting rights, including the restoration of voting rights to ex-felons, something that we debated last week. You might get his view on that too. Dr. Jones, welcome to Planet America.
Glad to be here.
So we've had Republicans, including President Trump, Senator Marco Rubio, both accusing Democrats of trying to steal this election in Florida. Have you seen any evidence to support those claims?
There's absolutely no evidence. I think that what the Republicans are doing is following a narrative that they feel will resonate with the increasing moral panic among their constituents. And so they're playing to a crowd, they're playing to a narrative that's worked for them in the past, but this is an unanchored narrative. It is objectively unanchored. There are no facts, there's no basis. This is simply politics. Unfortunately, it's like a political circus that we've seen before that shouldn't be going on.
Well, Professor, that's fraud, but what about incompetence? Broward County election supervisor Brenda Snipes has a long track record of missing ballots, or ballots turning up afterwards, or ballots being lost, ballots being destroyed, questions being left off ballots, a long track record of things going wrong on her watch. So are there any concerns about her competence?
Well, there's absolutely problems with the office, but it's hard to say that she is a particular problem. What's clear is that she has been under the spotlight, the Clegg lights of controversy for quite some time. Now, there's no question that they should not have found blank ballot boxes in a rental car. That should not have happened. And so she has made mistakes. But it's not clear to me that she's the issue. I think that the issue is that we're in the age of electronic and electromagnetic counting of ballots, where elections are hotly contested, and because of the complexity of the process and the complexity of the voting, there are going to be mistakes. Machines are going to break down. People are going to make mistakes. But I think to personalize the issue is wrong. This is a complex process. They shouldn't personalize it. But you see, when they personalize it, it gives the politicians a scapegoat. It gives them someone to point their finger at. But what should be happening is we should stop this distracting political narrative and focus on the business at hand, which is let's count the votes. Stop focusing on personality. Let's focus on how we count the votes. That's what democracy needs.
Given that, unlike 2000, where maybe a few hundred votes was ultimately deciding not just Florida but the presidency of the United States, we're talking about tens of thousands of votes here, which seem to suggest that we're not going to see any kind of overturning with even a hand recount. Does this mean this is really about that bigger picture, the longer term issue of voter rights and voter suppression?
Yeah, I don't think, I'm a Democrat, but I don't think that any of the litigation, any of the recounting, whether it's the manual or the hand recount, is going to change the result. I don't think that will happen. It could. I don't think so. But I do think that what you're seeing with the felon reenfranchisement will have a huge impact on future elections. Another thing I think you'll see is that the process of counting votes and letting people, we're going to have to take a look at that. I think we're going to take a look at that. And I think it's going to become fairer. We're going to see procedures and processes that will allow more people to vote and more people to vote effectively. Because you see, in the United States, you not only have a right to vote equally, but you have a right to vote in a meaningful way, in a meaningful manner. And this election is forcing us to look at those processes. They're going to improve as our technology is improving. So I think democracy is going to be the winner in this. It may not change the result, but future elections, I think that the process will be even more democratic than it's been in the past.
Talking about counting votes, Palm Beach County has been very insistent that their machines are old and they can't get the machine recount done in time for the deadline. Yet, let me just show you some footage from a local news channel showing the Palm Beach County Tabulation Centre only hours before their deadline. As you can see, it is an empty room. I just wonder if you have any theory at all what could be going on there.
Well, I think that their machines are breaking down, they're overheating, and that's not the fault of any particular supervisor. It's the problem that we just haven't allocated the resources. We simply expect things to work. Things have gotten more complex, but we haven't really upgraded our technology. How many millions of ballots they've got to count with limited personnel, and we're demanding an exactitude that we never demanded before. And the machines apparently just weren't up to it. I think that, the rules, the formal rules are going to have to bend to reality. And we're going to have to make sure that we give them the time they need. The main thing is we have to count every vote. The main thing is we have to make sure no vote is lost and make sure that we count them accurately. I think that, that the courts will read them the Riot Act. They will demand that they move quickly, but that ultimately we have to take into account that the machines and the people and the supervisors know better than the machines and equipment they have to work with.
Well, Professor Jones, we certainly appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for joining us.
God bless you.
All right, well, just to your point, by the way, about the recount being unlikely to change much, there have been 26 recounts since 2000. Yeah. 3 have been successful. And the average change of votes in those 3 recounts, 311. Rick Scott currently has a 12,000 vote lead, so I think he's safe.
Yes, and so is my opinion. It seems, according to Professor Jones, that the ex-felon law change is going to make a big, big difference. I think I won that argument.
No, I think I won, actually.
Okay, and now...
The incredibly long and expensive election campaign leading to the statistically likely re-election of President Trump 2020.
And just a week after the midterms, the race for the White House is officially underway. There are only 718 days to go. A new poll this week from Politico and Morning Consult gave former Vice President Joe Biden a 7-point lead over independent Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders as the preferred Democratic presidential nominee. In third place, Congressman and failed Texas Senate candidate Beto O'Rourke on 8%, ahead of Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren on 5%, Senator Kamala Harris of California on 4%, Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey on 3%, and former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg on 2%. And then among the pack on just 1%, former San Antonio Mayor and HUD Secretary Julian Castro, who met with big donors in Texas this week to explore his 2020 campaign prospects, as well as Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown, whose re-election last week in what is an increasingly Republican state had him talking about a presidential bid this week as well. Getting exactly zero support in this poll, lawyer Michael Avenatti, and that was in a poll that was taken before his arrest earlier this week for alleged domestic violence, a claim he has denied.
Can you score negative percentages, John?
Good question. Also in the zero zone, former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick and Congressman John Delaney, who has been officially running for president for a year and has spent literally millions on ads in places like Iowa to exactly no effect. And former Clinton advisor Mark Penn wrote in the Wall Street Journal this week that he thinks that Hillary Clinton will run for president again in 2020. Maybe not at first, but definitely, he says, by the time the primaries are in full swing. Penn notes her 75% approval rating among Democrats and her ongoing mission to become America's first female president.
Well, that's what Mark Penn thinks, but this is what Hillary Clinton thinks.
Do you want to run again?
No.
Wait.
No.
Yeah.
Seems relevant.
Yeah, well, it does, although notice she said she didn't want to run for president again, but she still wants to be president. She never wanted to run for president. Necessary evil. Now, despite sounding upbeat about the midterms last week, this week, numerous press reports have claimed that the president's mood has been darkening. One White House source telling friend of the show, Vanity Fair's Gabe Sherman, that Trump's temper has reached, quote, a level of insanity, unquote, he's never seen before. Trump was reportedly fuming at the negative reaction to his decision last Saturday to skip that memorial service at an American military cemetery north of Paris to commemorate the end of the First World War. The source telling Sherman that the president was worried his hair would be messed up in the rain and that advisors had warned him this no-show would be a big mistake. It was certainly a bit of a PR disaster, Chaz.
Yeah, look, I don't know whether the conditions were poor for flying, as the White House claimed.
Or poor for his hair.
Or poor for his hair, but I do know this. This is the Google map of the path from the US Embassy to the cemetery. It says 1 hour, 13 minutes by road. The White House says presidential convoys make everything more complicated, and I'm sure they do, but I doubt John Kelly caught an Uber there.
Yeah, but John Kelly doesn't have bone spurs, Chaz, to be fair. Now, the France trip was also marred by a spat between President Trump and the French President, Emmanuel Macron, who gave a speech with Trump in attendance, rebuking nationalism, and that came just days after Trump boasted about being a nationalist. President Trump also took offence, apparently, at remarks that Macron made about European military self-sufficiency. And yes, the president mentioned the war.
Emmanuel Macron suggests building its own army to protect Europe against the US, China, and Russia. But it was Germany in World Wars I and II. How did that work out for France? They were starting to learn German in Paris before the US came along. Pay for NATO or not?
Probably not his best tweet, but I'm actually blaming the news media for this one, I've got to say.
Fake news.
Yes, particularly the Wall Street Journal. You see, Macron had done a radio interview where he first said, "We are being shaken by hacking attempts in our cyberspace. We have to protect ourselves with respect to China, Russia, and even the USA." So he's talking about American hackers there, right? Not the American army. Then, later in the same interview, he said, Europe needs an army because, faced by Russia, which is on our borders and which has shown that it can be threatening, we need to have a Europe that can better defend itself by itself without depending solely on the United States. Okay, so he wants the army to protect against Russia.
Right.
Not America.
Which is what Trump's been telling them to do.
Exactly.
Okay.
But then the Wall Street Journal wrote that Macron called for the creation of a true European army, issuing a sharp critique of transatlantic security ties days before President Trump is due to visit France. Then they wrote about tensions with Trump for a paragraph before quoting Macron, "We have to protect ourselves with respect to China, Russia, and even the United States of America." Wrong. Macron never criticised Trump or transatlantic security ties. As you said, he agreed with what Trump had to say. And he didn't want the army to protect against America. It was to protect against Russia. That was a totally misleading article, and yet almost all the press followed the Wall Street Journal's lead.
The fake Street Journal.
Yes, so I am not surprised that Trump was confused. It was a shocker.
Yeah, maybe not fake news, just simple bad journalism. Meanwhile, the president used Twitter to grouse about French wine tariffs, Macron's low approval rating, the French unemployment rate, and to claim that France is more nationalistic than anyone. And he concluded with a resounding,
"Make France great again."
then, just for good measure,
By the way, when the helicopter couldn't fly to the first cemetery in France because of almost zero visibility, I suggested driving. Secret Service said no, too far from the airport, and Big Paris shut down. Speech next day at the American cemetery in pouring rain. Little reported. Fake news.
But then, back in the United States, President Trump opted to stay put in the White House on Monday, skipping the Veterans Day commemorations at Arlington National Cemetery. And, Chaz, there was all sorts of speculation about what was going on behind closed doors in the White House this week.
Yeah, because it wasn't just those things that Trump skipped. Trump is also skipping the APEC summit. He skipped meeting the Jordanian king in Washington. He skipped meeting the troops on the Mexican border. These are all things that Trump would normally do. So some people speculated the president might be depressed after the midterm results. But ABC America has pointed to another explanation. They've suggested that Trump and his lawyers have been answering written questions from Mueller about his investigation. And not just for a day, they've suggested it's been going all week, which would explain why Trump was so preoccupied. Or maybe he's just not feeling great. It does happen.
Yeah, big come down after a busy election campaign. Who knows? Following last week's sacking of Attorney General Jeff Sessions and the appointment of his Chief of Staff, Matt Whitaker, as the acting AG, the US media this week has been raking over Whitaker's past comments and his professional career. It's a little bit colourful. He owned a childcare centre, a trailer company and a concrete supplier, mostly in Iowa, but it is his work on the board of an invention marketing company accused of fraud and ultimately shuttered in May this year that has raised the most eyebrows. They are accused of offering to market all sorts of wacky inventions, like a DNA test proving Bigfoot exists, an extra deep, quote, masculine toilet for the well-endowed male, and time travel. And then ripping off the inventors by taking their money and not actually selling these crazy ideas of theirs.
I bet Trump wishes that he could travel back in time to before the vetting process. Not only was that company fined $26 million, but the FBI is still investigating them now. Now, Whitaker did only take $10,000 from that company. Right. But one of the things he did for these scammers, when frustrated consumers tried to get their money back, the company boss would use Whitaker to threaten them as a former federal prosecutor, which is pretty dodgy stuff. There have also been suggestions that Trump and Whitaker are chummy and that Trump might have met Whitaker dozens of times before appointing him. But Trump denied all that. Kind of.
I don't know Matt Whitaker. Matt Whitaker worked for Jeff Sessions, but I didn't know Matt Whitaker. Matt Whitaker is a great guy. I mean, I know Matt Whitaker.
Fox and Friends, they're so good. They even track you in advance.
Maybe they used the time machine.
Maybe. Look, the main issue with Whitaker is his appointment might not be legal. The White House says the Federal Vacancies Reform Act allows the president to direct any employee of an agency, like the Department of Justice, to perform the functions of a missing principal officer in an acting capacity. So, since Whitaker worked in the Department of Justice, he could theoretically be acting Attorney General. But the Constitution says the president can only appoint people by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. So it doesn't matter if it's only temporary, the person still needs to be Senate confirmed. Trump responded this way.
Whitaker was Senate confirmed, and now he doesn't need this, but he was Senate confirmed at the highest level when he was the U.S. Attorney from Iowa. Mueller was not Senate confirmed. Why didn't they get him Senate confirmed? He should have been Senate confirmed.
But Mueller doesn't have to be Senate confirmed. He's not a principal officer. He works under the Attorney General. Furthermore, Whitaker's confirmation to be a US attorney was in 2004, so that's kind of out of date. Also, Mueller has been Senate confirmed 4 times. The last time was in 2011, so these are not good arguments. And unhappily for Trump, any defense of this kind of appointment has already been ruled out by Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who said that if you appoint an acting officer who isn't Senate confirmed, all of their decisions become void. That doesn't just mean about Mueller, that means everything relating to the Department of Justice, including the FBI. Now that is a problem. So Trump's going to be wanting to sort this one out soon, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right there. Meanwhile, retiring Arizona Republican Senator Jeff Flake has issued an ultimatum this week telling the Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell he will not vote any judicial nominees out of the Senate Judiciary Committee or vote to confirm them on the Senate floor until the Mueller protection bill he's been pushing is brought to a vote. That bill would prevent Matt Whitaker from sacking Bob Mueller.
Of course, you'll need one more vote to make that blockade stick. Maybe Susan Collins.
Susan Collins. Well, Senator Jeff Flake, meanwhile, says that somebody should challenge Donald Trump for the Republican Party's presidential nomination in 2020, and it might be him.
I think the Republicans need to be reminded of what conservatism really is and what it means to be decent.
Well, a poll just this week from Monmouth University gave President Trump a 43% approval rating. That's about on par, but it found only 37% of voters want Trump to run for re-election in 2020. 58% are opposed to him running again. 36% say they would like to see him impeached before he can stand for re-election. Still, history shows an incumbent president is very tough, if not impossible, to beat from within their own party.
According to the resolution approved,
Jerry Ford was a moderate Republican congressman and House Minority Leader when he was suddenly appointed Vice President in October 1973 after Spiro Agnew resigned in the face of a corruption scandal.
I proudly present to you the man whose name I will submit to the Congress of the United States, Gerald Ford of Michigan.
10 months later, Richard Nixon also resigned to avoid impeachment over his role in the Watergate cover-up.
Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
It was the first time someone who had never stood for the vice presidency or the presidency had taken the oath of office.
I am acutely aware that you have not elected me as your president by your ballots. So I ask you to confirm me as your president with your prayers.
Just 1 month into his accidental presidency, Jerry Ford tried to draw a line under the whole Watergate affair, letting Nixon off the hook.
A full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
That pardon looked to some like a grubby deal, and Ford's approval rating crashed from 71% to 37% in a few months. Being unelected and unpopular, Ford was vulnerable to a challenge from fellow Republicans, and he got it in the form of former California Governor Ronald Reagan.
Have you done serious dramatic parts?
Oh, yeah. Reagan was a one-time Hollywood actor, Democrat and union leader, now a staunch anti-communist conservative.
I've called this press conference to announce that I am a candidate for the presidency and to ask for the support of all Americans who share my belief that our nation needs to embark on a new and constructive course.
1976 was also the first time all states held primaries or caucuses to decide the Republican nomination. And President Ford began strongly in January and February, ticking off wins in Iowa, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Vermont and Florida.
We're number 2 in a world where it's dangerous, if not fatal, to be second best.
Just when Reagan's campaign looked doomed, he won North Carolina in late March, lost in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, then stormed back in Texas, Georgia, Indiana and Nebraska, running as an outsider looking to shake up Washington.
A few days ago, Mr. Ford expressed his belief that we must have a continuity of government in Washington. Well, my belief is to the contrary. We should not continue the present course of government.
Reagan and Ford swapped victories through to June. In the end, neither of them had the required 1,130 delegates to win the nomination. Ford was just 9 short. Reagan needed another 52. Reagan tried to seize the initiative and the nomination by announcing his running mate, moderate Senator Richard Schweiker.
Neither side has it sewed up. It is still out there to be won.
The Republican convention in Kansas City in August saw a floor vote for the nomination. After a lot of haggling and arm twisting, Jerry Ford prevailed, winning on the first ballot. But Reagan's impromptu convention speech had plenty of delegates immediately wondering if they'd picked the wrong candidate.
We must go forth from here united, determined. There is no substitute for victory.
In defeat, Reagan rallied the troops, but President Ford was lagging behind the Democratic nominee, Jimmy Carter, by up to 30 points. And Ford's campaign wasn't helped by gaffes like,
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
Yeah, there was. Still, in the end, Ford only lost to Jimmy Carter by 2 points. Reagan, of course, would run again 4 years later and crush Carter, consolidating the Conservative hold on the Republican Party.
There you go again.
In 1980, Jimmy Carter was also challenged for his party's nomination by Senator Edward Kennedy. Both examples suggest that while a sitting president can fend off a challenge from within their own party, it reveals their vulnerabilities in the general election that follows.
ABC now projects Carter is the winner, the next president of the United States.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes, welcome to the Fireside to have a chat about some of the big news events of the week. And of course, Chaz, with the House majority for the Democrats, and has now come the debate over who the Speaker of the House, the most senior member of the Democratic caucus, should be. Everyone was assuming it was going to be Nancy Pelosi. There are all those anti-Nancy Pelosi ads being run by Republicans, but it may not be a done deal.
Absolutely not, because the Democrats have, a 13, 14, 15 seat majority maybe. There are 17 incumbent and incoming Democrat congressmen who are on the record as saying they refuse to vote for Nancy Pelosi. So that is enough to defeat her as the
But that
Speaker.
still leaves her with maybe 200 votes. And people say that she is arguably the most effective legislator in at least since Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. If it wasn't for Nancy Pelosi, there would be no Obamacare. She got the Affordable Care Act passed.
Not only did she get that passed, but she also got a carbon tax passed, which the Senate rejected that. But she got a lot of things passed under Obama. She was very effective. There's no doubt about it.
So what's their gripe? What's their rationale for getting rid of her?
It's just that she's unpopular. Even Democrats, there's a poll out from the week before the election, 39% of Democrats say she should be Speaker. 56% said she shouldn't be Speaker. She's spent 10 years being vilified by Conservatives. And the thing that's weird about this, anyone who replaces her will also be vilified by Conservatives. I would have thought right after an election when they ran ads against her and they didn't work, that would be the time to keep her as Speaker.
A pickup of 40 seats when it was made all about Pelosi.
Yeah.
That seems logical. One of the arguments, though, is about her age. And it's true to say, at 78, she is no spring chicken.
No, she's not.
To be elected the Speaker again. But then again, Bernie Sanders is 77, and people are still talking about him running for president in 2 years from now for a 4-year term.
Yeah, well, that's true. And it's not just her. Her number 2, Steny Hoyer, is also, I think, a 78 or 79. Her number 3, Jim Clyburn, is also about 78. All three of them are very old. So I understand the need to get change, to get turnover, absolutely. But what about the number 2 and number 3 who have been doing nothing for the last 10 years? Why don't you get rid of them and get some fresh blood in there to blood them? Because Nancy Pelosi's already said she's only going to be around for another year or two. She's a transitional speaker. So why don't you blood in the next generation through number 2 and number 3?
And of course, the other debate this week is...
by the way, sorry.
Yeah.
No one stepped forward to challenge her yet either.
Yeah.
You need to have a challenger first.
Right, it's an empty seat challenge at this stage, although there is some talk of Martha Fudge maybe being, and she's almost in a way is kind of a younger Pelosi. She's got a lot of support, so that's a possibility. Now, criminal justice reform. Everyone was saying as soon as these midterms were over, there would be no hope for bipartisanship, gridlock again. Suddenly, bipartisanship.
Well, this is something that Trump's been pushing for a while. The First Step
Kim
Act...
Kardashian's been pushing for a while.
That is true. And Jared Kushner as well was really hands-on with this kind of stuff. But to Trump's credit, he's the one who has brought it up again and said, let's get this done. And it really is to Trump's credit, because this is a good bill. There's a lot of good stuff it does. For instance, it reduces minimum sentencing quite a lot for drug crimes. It gives justices more sentencing flexibility as well. So that way you don't have these huge prison sentences for crack cocaine or something like that when there's no violence. Another thing which is really important is when they get out, what happens to them then? Because there was a poll by the US Sentencing Commission where 50% of reoffenders go back in after the first 21 months. So this encourages reintegration to society by encouraging them to train and to have education within prison.
And to make it easier for them to get guns as ex-felons as well. That's compromise, though. That's compromise.
That's good news as well. And also, this is the most important thing. It puts prisons close to home. Because lots of studies show when the prisons are on the other side of America, they become more desocialised and much more likely to reoffend afterwards. So it's a good bill.
Now, talking about felons and ex-felons as well, there's a connection to these wildfires, terrible wildfires we're seeing in California.
There absolutely is. The people who are fighting the wildfires are often prisoners, because in California they have a situation where these prisoners get paid $1 an hour to fight fires. But here is the irony of it all. Those prisoners, when they're released from jail, can't be firefighters.
Really?
They're not allowed to be.
It's okay to be a prisoner fighting fires, but not an ex-prisoner as a firefighter.
No, that's which is really weird. But I just want to talk about the California fires generally, because they don't get discussed much. They're the most destructive in California history. We're talking 48 dead from the Camp Fire, 61 dead for the whole fire season, right?
That's twice as bad as any previous wildfires in California.
29 was the record before, so this is huge. It was probably started by humans, 84% of them are. But this is the important thing about this. Have a look at this graph. This is the graph of the length of the Western wildfire season. It used to be 5 months a year, now it's 8 months a year. That's just over a 40-year period. It's increased that much. That is because of dryness and because of heat. In other words, climate change. Now, some people say that there are less fires than used to be. That is true. It's because they now spend $700 million on fire retardation, whereas only 7 years ago they spent $90 million. But the fact is, 30 biggest California fires ever in area are since 2000. 9 of the 10 most destructive fires ever are since 2000. So here is a real sign of something we need to pay attention, because people are dying.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting debate as well about how they probably got fire management wrong for 100 years or more, where they just try and put out a fire as quickly as possible, and as a result, they just built up the fuel load and built up the fuel load. So it's a really interesting debate. But with that, look, we are right out of time, but there is so much more that we can talk about. We'll put that on Facebook. We'll have a big Facebook extra conversation for you by the fireside. But before we go, an old friend is back.
Yes, Mitt Romney, this senator-elect for Utah. He's been everywhere. Let's hear what he has to say about it.
Bye-bye.
I've been to Springville, Circleville, Carbonville, Paragona, Orderville, Rockville, Kaysville, Amanilla, Cedar City, Brigham City, Garden City, even Mona, Lehigh, Nephi, Manti, Annabella, Beaver, Heber, Draper, Hurricane. I've been everywhere.